have a panel with me that are going to give a large amount of information on a range of these different issues. Firstly, we have Professor Tim Leunig from Department of Education. He's going to talk a little bit about the reasons behind the reforms and what was the rationale for reforming the A-levels. Then we have James Ludley from the PSA office, and he's going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing with PSA to try and support reforms and to try and play a role in terms of the consultations around A-level reforms. And then we have Richard Kelly, who is head of politics at Manchester Grammar School, and he's going to talk a little bit about how these A-level reforms might be impacting upon teachers. Richard is a very active member in our teachers group within the PSA, and he's going to kind of give some feedback about the sort of implications from his perspective. So, I think we're going to start with you. If we do 15 minutes or so each, and then we'll open up for questions.
There we are, that is my one and only slide. Sometimes when slides are very useful, when I'm giving big first year lectures at the LSE, they get a lot of slides, which also helps me to remember the content from one year to another. Because if you're giving introductory economic history lectures on things ranging from why apartheid failed to the invention of mass production, it's got to be said you are not an expert in any of them. Every year I get the odd student who says, the depth of Professor Leunig's knowledge is remarkable. And if they cross that depth from a width, then it might be more accurate. But for audiences like this, I'm afraid you don't get any slides, which at least some of you appreciate. So I have two jobs. I teach at the London School of Economics. This afternoon I shall be researching the speed of stagecoaches in the early 90s. Don't laugh! I'm looking at how the invention of turnpikes and better roads sped up stagecoaches, and then quantifying the value of that to society, building on earlier work I'd done which showed that the invention of the railway was worth 10% of GDP in terms of time saved. I used to tease Andrew Adonis that high-speed rail, if it could get me from here to Sydney in 2 hours, that would be the same time saving as the original railway, and frankly high-speed 2 was just an incremental change. It's fair to say Andrew never invited me to appear on platforms with him. Now, I'm also at the DFE, and I joined there 2.5 years ago as a ministerial advisor, not as a special advisor, but as a policy advisor. So I was always under the Civil Service Code. I was a deputy director, but I was hired because I knew ministers. That was part of it, as well as for my expertise. And one thing that's really shocking is just how much stuff ministers are asked to do and make decisions on. And that does mean they're under a lot of time pressure. You see the amount of papers that they get. It got to the point where David Laws had a meeting while his arm was being set. Literally. And he spoke to Mike Green and said, I might have to stop if the doctor speaks to me. Mike said, well, if the doctor calls you in, let me know. Mike's in charge of our rebuilding program. We're spending £2 billion rebuilding schools. He said, no, I'm with the doctor at the moment. He's setting my arm. And Mike said, well, I can bring you back later. And David said, there'll be no time. And anyway, the doctor only needs my arm. He doesn't need my brain, my mouth, or my ears. And thus they had a discussion about this rebuilding program. So it's not the case that ministers spend hours and hours and hours on decisions. There are many, many urgent decisions that they are required to make. And sometimes that can squeeze out time to think. But ministers did think quite a lot about A-level reform, and at least about the underlying principles. Most of the hard work is done by the awarding bodies and Ofqual. But what were their aims? Well, their aims, I think, were as follows. They accept that A-levels are now not really a terminal qualification for many people. Most people who do A-levels, particularly if they do 3, go on to university. So A-levels these days are very much a stepping stone qualification, whereas GCSEs are both. Many people leave formal education after their GCSEs. That's not really true of A-levels these days. And that means that A-levels have, if you like, a very clear customer, which is you, and with my other hat on, me, it's universities. A-levels really matter to universities. And so the government wanted to reconnect A-levels to universities. And I think there was a little bit of nostalgia for the days when you had University of London Board, etc. And that sense, sometimes I think more apparent than real in the good old days, that universities were more involved. And there's been a similar thing with vocational qualifications. Alison Wolfe led a big review which culled vast numbers of vocational qualifications, most of them taken only by a handful of people, and they were culled if they were not recognised by employers. Because a qualification is only useful if it's recognised by the people who you then want to go on and work with or study with. So, Universities, we wanted them involved big time, and we have been moderately successful in this. So we now have ALCAB, which is a Russell Group formed group to look at syllabuses. And it's got to be said that a lot of academics told us they wanted more involvement in A-level syllabuses. And then we said, okay, go for it. And they said, oh, well, yes. Okay, when will you have it done by now? Oh, well, what about the year after next for a committee to begin to think about? Academics move at you're all academics, and I'm an academic as well. We don't move at the same pace as government would like us to do. Government wants people to drop everything and start working on this. And academics say, well, things like, well, I've got examining to do. Perfectly little, I got a new course, I'm on sabbatical, I'm away next term, we want to talk, we want to consult. These are all bona fide things to do. But there was a sense from our point of view in which academics weren't rushing forward at the rate we would have liked them to do it. And a good exception here is Mark Smith at Lancaster, VC there, who has been absolutely excellent. He basically volunteered and said, okay, I'll do it, I'll work your timetables whenever possible. And that's why he's leading on a lot of this. And the thing I would say to you in working with government spends ages thinking about other things, then they will alight on the problem you're interested in, at which point they expect you to drop everything and jump forward. And if you are willing to do that, you will be much more successful in influencing government than if you are not. And it is perfectly legitimate for you to turn around and say, but you could have thought about this 6 months ago when I was free. And it's true, he could have done, but there would have been something else that was going on in sanctuary buildings, asbestos, Ebola, When those 2 children were abandoned in a hospital in Newcastle to be tested for Ebola, that was not on the list of contingencies for which we had planned. We have got a lot of planning for Ebola, I can tell you. That sort of thing takes a lot of time. Public Health England is working out how to deal with Ebola in prisons, just in case it happens. There's an awful lot of planning for stuff that doesn't happen. And that means important things like this, when they slot in, you kind of have to jump. So, one thing we were convinced by was the case for linearity rather than modularity. Because we want people to do more substantive work. We don't want them to be working for 6 weeks, do an exam or piece of controlled assessment, and then forget it and move on. And universities were saying to us, both privately and formally, that too many kids were coming through without the ability to write an extended essay, without ever having thought about something at length. So hence the move to linearity. That also gives people 5 teaching terms rather than 4 in what is still colloquially known as the 6th form, although we now call years 12 and 13. We've got rid of AS levels in the first year. Now that's not, there are people who think that was the wrong decision, I'll be honest and acknowledge that, and there are people who think that's the right decision. I think it's fair to say we've had a very even post-bag on that one, and since you generally get far more letters of protest when you make any change, that makes us think we are onto something that is reasonable. And not quite, Nigel Lawson in his autobiography says if you don't get 10 letters of protest for every one of praise, you're doing something good. When they abolished, in the old days, you had to get your passport stamped to get any foreign currency. And when Lawson abolished that in 79-80, he got 10 letters of protest saying he destroyed part of the essential excitement of going abroad, going down to the post office and getting your passport stamped. You've had this year's foreign currency allocation. He got 10 letters of protest for every one of support. And he said this was obviously the right thing to do, but that led him to create a 10-to-1 protest. So linearity and no January exams. So we don't want people taking exams time and time again. We found one school where the average child is taking maths GCSE 8 times. It's really hard to think of a pedagogic basis on which that is a fair way to treat a child or a good way to teach them maths. Well, there's always variation in examining standards. You will know that as examiners, I know that as an examiner. Unless the exam is just multi-choice, there's always going to be discretionary marking. So obviously if you take an exam 8 times, on one occasion you'll just get a bit lucky. That is not the way to teach children or get them qualifications. We also wanted to boost the content of some of the courses, and in particular to boost the content of maths in various courses. So we've been much more explicit about the quantity and depth of maths in science subjects, but also in business studies and economics. So there is now a written requirement in business studies, for example, that the maths can and should be at the level of a C grade of GCSE. So you can't just say, as used to be the case, you've got to be able to do a pie chart to get A-level business studies. That's just not acceptable. If you think about it, business does use algebra. Profit is revenue minus cost. Cost in turn is made up of fixed costs and variable costs. Variable costs are quantity times by unit costs. You ought to be able to put all those things together by substituting one pretty simple linear equation into another one. It's not unrealistic to say if you're going to do business studies A-level, that maths to the quality of GCSE is a sensible point. The same is true in economics. We've also increased the amount of bench science in A-levels. Again, at the explicit request of universities. Universities told us in science departments that the kids were coming up, not quite, but what's that? Oh, it's a Bunsen burner. What does that do? I exaggerate, obviously, but they said we want them to have just done more of this stuff. Because only by burning magnesium in air do you realise that actually it's a lot harder. You never get the right result. And understanding what it means to be a scientist, that science is an empirical subject that is based on doing stuff and observing it. Similarly, in A-level English, we've reduced the number of texts from 12 to 8, so that kids should be studying. I always look at kids, I get to a lot occasionally. Kids should, including my own, kids should be studying each text in more depth. We don't want them to know 12 things superficially, we want them to know 8 things rather better. And we've also, ironically perhaps, reduced the amount of British history. So there used to be a requirement that every A-level had 25% British history, and that's now gone down to 20. Now some of you will know that Michael Gove is a passionate believer in British history. Passionate believer. GCO, the school curriculum up to the age of 16 is now based on British history and chronological history. Why did we go the other way in A-level? Because that's what university academics told us they wanted. A-levels are university-led. Up to GCSE is a national curriculum, and it is right and proper that the Secretary of State has a greater degree of control there. But his view was, having done the new GCSE in particular, they'd already got the British history, and they didn't need the same level at A-level. And I'm sure had the committee said there should be no requirement for British history, we would have gone along with that as well. To the best of my knowledge, there was no overruling of the outside bodies at any point. Finally, I want to say one thing about maths, because the other thing we have created, and this fits in with AS levels, is a new thing called mid-level maths, which is a Cambridge-written program based on various stuff in the US. Berkeley, for example, has a qualification called Maths for Presidents. So the idea is Berkeley is aspiring to create the next president of the United States and perhaps other places. And they argue that in a modern world, we need more people to have a better knowledge of mathematics. And ever so often they survey members of parliament and other people and say, if I toss a coin twice, what is the chance of getting 2 heads? And depressingly, the most common result is 50%. And they also ask people, do you think you're good at understanding maths? And most of the people who think it's 50% say yes. What can I say? I'll look at the record. No, I better not say it anyway. That's obviously untrue. So Britain is about the only country in the developed world where maths is not a requirement to 18. And indeed, Tristram Hunter's argued it should be a requirement to 18, and I spoke to a bunch of heads recently who told me it was a requirement to 18 because they'd heard it on the telly. And I said, was the guy sort of tall and good looking? They said, we heard the minister announce it yesterday on the television. I said, was he sort of tall and good looking? They said, oh yes. I said, no, he's the opposition. And they really did think this was a government announcement, so I'm sure Tristram will be very proud of that, but it led to a lot of confusion at this conference, I can tell. But we do share his ambition that more people should study maths, but not necessarily to A-level. Because one thing we know about maths is it has the strongest and tightest transition matrix from your GCSE grade to your A-level grade. If you don't have an A grade or better in GCSE maths, your chance of getting a reasonable grade in A-level is really pretty darn small. That's much less true than, say, in history. You can actually start history A-level with a C or a B and have a reasonable chance of getting the same grade in A-level. That's pretty much impossible in maths. But what we do want are the C-grade maths people to do some more maths. So, because maths is one of those things that practice does make perfect, and that familiarity leads to a depth of understanding. And hence we've created this mid-level maths course, which we hope many people will do. We do hope that many people will do 3 A-levels, 1 linear AS level, which could, as I think the slides say, be politics and government, but also that they will do a bit more maths, because there are so many jobs, so many careers, which in the past you wouldn't have thought that knowing some maths was useful for, that now do. And I think that is part of creating a more rounded society. So I'm going to stop there. You've got some excellent slides. The only thing I'm going to tell him before he begins is that third wave does not equal third rank. Always good to get your comment in before.
Thank you, Tim. I think at this stage, it's probably just to introduce myself maybe to the room. I was appointed as a new role for the PSA in April of this year. Part of my time is actually working with the Education and Skills Committee under Rose. Obviously, as Rose at the top, this has become an area of critical concern for the committee. And in particular, I'm going to talk to you for the next 5-10 minutes or so about the viewpoint of professional body, in particular the government and politics A-level and the impacts of A-level reform to that. But also just a thank you to Neil and the elective for actually putting this as a platform. I think it's the first time the schools issue has been put on the agenda for the heads of department conference, so I think that's a good step in the right direction. So really, why is this important for the subject? Well, I mean, obviously it's critical for government and politics at the moment of the 2000 Members Association. We've doubled recently the number of PSA teacher members. We now have about 170 schools that are affiliated with the association. So actually, there's a whole number of students that are under the sort of bit of the PSA for the Education and Skills Subcommittee. There's actually a lack of GCSE and political studies, which means that when they get to A-level, it serves as an introduction to the discipline before university. So it's quite an important A-level in this sense. Actually, it's a very valued subject. There's little overlap between the study in terms of content and skills. Actually, it's a good entry point, and I think it sometimes maybe lacks clout and is seen as a humanities subject. It could also be argued perhaps that it's actually in a small number of institutions that a large number of students take the subject. I'll come on to some figures later on, and I don't want to overlap too much with Richard's slide. He's got some more stats for you as well from the viewpoint of teachers. But it is an important subject, and actually in the third wave of reform, what you might find is there's an uncertainty around whether government and politics will continue. I'll come on to talk about why that's the case in a second. So it's important for the reform because it is a popular additional choice for students. So what you find is actually a lot of students will take government and politics perhaps as a fourth choice subject. So in a situation where you've got one of 3 linear A-level subjects, the question sort of remains, will students actually take government and politics as one of 3? And actually exam boards aren't obliged to produce co-teachable A and AS level subjects. And I'll come on to talk a bit more about that and what that means and detail of that in a second. But effectively, the idea of removing the AS level completely could see that students won't have that fourth choice, and obviously one of 3 government and politics could fall by the wayside. Actually, exam boards have understandably perhaps been slow to respond to and communicate their course development changes. So what you find is actually, even with the big exam boards, government and politics, they serve as subject specialists for a lot of subjects. A lot of the humanities subjects, perhaps history, mainly is the one that they also produce. I think you'll find there's a lot of support with the subject specialists to continue government and politics, but what you obviously notice with that is obviously it's their own interests, it's their job purposes that they produce new course specification. The course specification has to be ready for first teaching from 2017. So government and politics is in the third wave of subject reform. And the history of this, I think Rich is going to talk more about. But what you'll find is actually the AS level qualification could wither on the vine. And in many ways, I guess that's the idea of moving to a linear subject. I mean, I guess from the association point of view, we're not making the case for linear or modular principle. That's not really our position to do so. But we can certainly see the concerns and the information that's being relayed from the teachers group. And actually, a lot of this comes as a critical point because of the work that we've been doing with our teachers group. So this slide just shows the retention rate between AS to A level for government and politics over the last 3 periods. So what you'll find is actually around a 40% drop, 30 and 35% drop of students will go from having taken the AS level in the first year and then will not take the full A level in the second year. I mean, compared to other subjects, this is probably quite high. However, I think what it demonstrates is actually as a subject where students are coming into it for the first time at the post-16, they actually are having not had any previous experience with the subject, are actually taking the subject to AS, and a lot of them are continuing with the subject. There's actually an incredible popularity, I think, to continue studying politics into the second year of A-level. And I think if we were to remove that option, that would be detrimental to students, because they wouldn't obviously have that first chance. Now, obviously, from the association point of view, that when we start needing to look more at Key Stage 4 and actually making more of a case for studying politics earlier in the sort of educational pipeline, perhaps. But I think also there's a couple of other number of factors why this retention rate is not as good as it could be, perhaps. I mean, some of the AS content is quite dry. Obviously, students coming into for the first time, the subject matter is a little bit it's the sort of mechanics rather than the actual sort of nitty-gritty of politics. And actually, the reforms could be very useful in this sense. I mean, part of the reason for reform it isn't necessarily just to move to linear, but it's also to actually revamp the content that's available to students. And actually, I think if we reach a stage, I certainly welcome that side of things. Obviously, I mentioned it being a fourth choice, which is obviously the reason why there could be a drop. But also, it's not a facilitating subject of the Russell Group. It's a subject that perhaps is taken as a fourth option, and then it's not needed to continue their studies. Anecdotally speaking to the teachers or from our membership, obviously subjects such as maths and other things like that, they are continued because they're required, particularly for PPE and other subjects such as that. So again, on the back of that though, this year did see an enormously encouraging number of AS entries. So obviously there is a good jump this year of the number of students who are taking politics for the first time. And again, I think that just continues to show that it's a popular fourth choice. Just sort of maybe talking slightly off subject, one of the things that the association has been doing is our speakers program for schools. This is where we're facilitating academic members to go into schools and take lessons on curriculum. I know I speak to a lot of your colleagues in your departments right across the UK. And actually, it's a really good way of showing some depth and actually really tapping into some of those AS subjects particularly, which are quite dry, maybe having a different voice and academic element to it. Actually, I think the teacher members really appreciate that. So that's something we're going to continue to make more of. But there is an issue of decoupling the AS and A-level, and actually, Glenn Stacey, the Ofqual's chief regulator, only 2 weeks ago admitted, this is the biggest concern that has been surrounding these changes. And actually, it's something that I still think is still quite unclear in terms of the communications that are coming from Ofqual, from perhaps what governments are wishing to do. I think it falls onto two sides. So on one hand, there is this formal decoupling of removing the AS from the A-level completely by Ofqual, who are overseeing that as the body to do so. But on the other hand, there's now this factor that AS and A-levels can be co-teachable. So it's a slight sort of contradiction in terms of that. And actually the problem is twofold really. The first one being quite straightforward, that the exam boards aren't obliged to produce materials that are co-teachable. So in most cases they are, and actually for the first wave of subjects you'll find that's been relatively straightforward, and I think that across the board, Tim might know on this, is been true. But for third wave subjects and subjects such as government and politics that fall in that final group of subjects to be reformed, actually what you'll find is obviously there needs to be a commercial appetite from the exam boards, there needs to be a decision and a sort of vibrancy from the schools that teach it to support the idea of having a co-teachable specification. And actually this in turn could lead to a second problem, and this has come up quite often with our teachers group, is that actually will state schools or colleges, the equivalent of a two-tier system, would they be able to afford, or can they in both AS and A-level? Because the communications around whether the AS will continue with full qualification on its own are still quite unclear. So would state schools and colleges be prepared to pay for students to sit an exam if by the end of it they don't actually have a qualification alongside them because they'll come out with a full A-level? And I think that's a serious concern if that is the case. So just to really run through what the PSA has been doing so far with all these issues, as I say, it became a critical concern probably during the summer and autumn months, but in January next year we're convening a meeting of the awarding bodies in London. I'd certainly welcome any of you along if you wish to come and join us for that. We're sorting a venue out, but this will be with the main awarding bodies and an audience of government and politics teachers. And again, it's just trying to reiterate to the awarding bodies that there is an appetite for new course specification. There are a large number of students who do take this qualification, which will show you from some figures on that. We've raised the concerns with the Department for Education, with BIS, particularly around the issue of narrowing the A-level syllabus, if there's only 3 linear subjects, particularly from the viewpoint of government and politics as a fourth choice. And obviously there could be a knock-on implications for admission. It's very difficult to pull some solid data in terms of how many students who take government and politics then go on to do politics at university. And speaking to someone from... Yeah, Marcus, that's very useful. But speaking to someone who didn't do government and politics but then went into a politics degree, it's obviously not necessary. However, I think students who do get the opportunity to do it for the first time post-16 do find it's a subject that they value, something that they actually want to continue. And that tends to be the message that comes across from our teacher members. Additionally, we produced a briefing paper in the summer which outlined a lot of these concerns. I think we did email it around to the department. We responded to Offer Calls consultation. The results of that actually came out this week. There wasn't a huge deal more detail in terms of subjects for 2017, unfortunately, in that consultation. And obviously, I guess a lot of this has helped us build stronger, foster stronger links with examining and awarding bodies, as well as our teacher members, actually. In many ways, you could argue that this has been a driving factor in increasing our teacher membership, this being an issue for them, and obviously ourselves as the umbrella body for that. So I guess really this sort of leads to, well, actually, what could you do to help this, or how would this sort of impact on you? And a lot of the conversations that come out of the teachers group meetings that we have, I think they would value or feel that if departments could promote or encourage government and politics, not explicitly, but maybe somewhere in the prospectuses or websites saying, this is a valued subject, or something that certainly would be viewed as a positive when applying to do a politics degree, or even perhaps taking politics modules along the line. And actually, don't just leave this to us in many ways. I mean, we will be lobbying the exam boards, but it would be also useful if heads of departments would also possibly speak to exam boards and awarding bodies, ensuring that government and politics will remain in A-level in 2017. I think actually having your own input, and as Tim said, I think HE involvement in this is valued. I certainly think that would be in the right direction. So I think that's me done.
I'll stand up because I've been a schoolmaster for 31 years and it's now impossible for me to speak without standing up. My family hates me, that's the way it is. The great thing about going third is that means I can sort of obliterate most of my talk because it's already been covered by the 2 earlier speakers. So I'll leave a few slides and we'll all get to the end of this particular session that much quicker. I want to just quickly look at the current position as I understand it. Just picking up on what Tim said. When the reforms were unveiled at the start of 2013, there did seem to be this huge stress on the new linearity and moving away from the sort of modular, bite-sized examinations that have been characteristic of sixth form exams since 2000. But I've got reason to believe that in the sort of months that followed, there was enormous pressure placed upon Tim and Michael Gove and people over at the department to think again about this. I just want to say a little bit about the provenance of this talk. I'm head of politics at Manchester Grammar School, and I think that Manchester Grammar School probably has the oldest A-level politics department in the country. It was founded back in the early 1970s by a protege of the late great Bernard Crick of this parish. And the protege concerned had just finished a doctoral thesis on Harold Lasky and was desperate to find some work and ended up doing a bit of history teaching at Manchester Grammar School. And in his first week, when he was in the library, he found a book that bore H.J. Lasky's signature. At that point, he realised that Lasky was an old boy in the school. We thought, well, why aren't we honouring his legacy a bit more and doing some politics teaching? So it was set up in the early 1970s. It's been around for 40 years. And quite a few people have passed through our doors who are now in a position, happily, to pass information back to us as to what might be happening among the movers and shakers. I was delighted to find out a few weeks ago that one of our alumni, Michael Crick, won the PSA prize. Faisal Islam has just taken over as the director of Sky News. He still owes me an essay on local government. But, we've got quite a few MPs, loads of PPCs, and quite a few spouts whose identity are openly to Tim today. And they argue that there was quite a lot of pressure placed upon Michael Gove in those early months after the reform was to be able to think again about this linearity and this whole decoupling business, because they argue that a lot of centres around the country, a lot of schools were saying that they would be able to cope with offering both a new linear, old-fashioned A-level and a separate AS. We also hear from a number of university sources, I don't know whether you can corroborate this, that there was a lot of unease among universities about the disappearance, potentially, of an AS examination, which did offer some empirical guide to how someone was going to do at A level and how they were going to do when they got to university. Cambridge were always telling us, anyway, that there was a link between AS examinations and eventual degree class. Now, it seems likely that those sort of views would have been at least listened to by Michael Gove and others. And as a result, this is where I think we are now. There has been a shift from the original position when, as James said earlier, there was this stress on linearity and a stress on decoupling, that AS and A-level were now completely different qualifications in much the same way that O-level and A-level used to be. That, happily, has changed, and I think we've now reached a situation of this quiet compromise, which you might call optional linearity for some. So, as I understand it, when the reform comes through, yes, those who want to move towards a traditional A-level examination can do so, but if you don't worry, because you can do an AS examination in the lower six, exactly as you're doing now, and then use that as a building block for the completion of an A-level in the upper six. The only difference between that and the current situation is that the AS examination will not make a contribution to the eventual mark. And a lot of people are a little bit confused by that, but for people of my generation, this is the status quo ante. It's what I call the Brit-Con model. I'm old enough to have done politics in the 1970s. It involved doing O-level Brit-Con with the help of Harvey and Bader in the lower six, pocket that, and then do a separate A-level Brit-Con in the upper six. Now, of course, the O-level mark would make no contribution to your A-level grade. You couldn't do A-level without doing O-level first, and I think that's more or less where we're back to now. So it is back to the old Brit-Con, Harvey and Bader model, very comfortable indeed for people like me. As was mentioned before, it was very, very difficult, of course, for Tim and his colleagues to bring all these changes in at once, so we've seen three waves of reform. My understanding is that the first wave of reform subjects, namely those to be introduced in 2015, would be the large facilitating guaranteed subjects and so on. And then it would be followed by subjects which seem to have less numbers. And just leaping a little bit, just to use an illustration of this. To understand why government and politics A-level would be the last subject to be reformed, why it wasn't with the big guns in the first wave, just look at the numbers there. Last year, just under 14,000 people sat A-level politics at the end of their upper six, perhaps. And you can see that compared to English, maths, chemistry, and so on, we weren't a particularly big hitter. A lot of people are surprised at the disparity between the number of people doing politics and the number of people doing sociology and psychology. It seems to me that we're losing the women on this one. There's a very high percentage of female students doing psychology and sociology. Less so, it seems, with politics. I'd love to know anecdotally what the situation is at university level, but I hear that there's a very high percentage of blokes doing government and politics at university level. So fair cop, you can understand why we couldn't possibly be accommodated in the first wave, or bigger subjects to be accommodated. But this is where it starts to get a bit strange, because if we look at subjects coming in the second wave, we've got subjects like French with 10,500, music 8,000, Spanish 7, etc., etc. Now, hold on, let's just go back. Politics had 13.7. Why aren't we in the second wave? Why have we been relegated to this rather precarious position in the third wave? Well, this is where perhaps I can offer something a little bit distinctive. My own sense here is that government and politics suffers some uncertainty at the moment. We're not absolutely clear it is going to be reformed. Whenever I speak to the examination boards, they and ah as to whether this politics, this new politics A-level will exist in our subject. The whole thing has been delayed in a way that's very worrying for politics teachers at school, and I would suggest it should also worry you lot in higher education, because if government and politics isn't reformed at A-level, I think it will have a knock-on effect. Because again, I'm picking up less than empirically that about 50 to 60% of your first year undergraduates have done A-level politics. So it has big implications for people here. As to why this happened, I think a lot has to do with the demise of the Old Politics Association. I know John Todd was active in that for a while. This was a brilliant organisation. I owe it my livelihood, to be honest. It was set up by people like Bernard Crick and Derek Heater in the 1960s to promote political education in schools. And when I was starting out as a politics teacher in the early 1980s, this Politics Association, then driven by people like Philip Norton and Bill Jones, Bill Coxall, Linton Robbins, did a fantastic job in raising the profile of the subject, getting in touch with schools and colleges saying, have you looked at A-level politics? If not, why not? And so on. And the numbers grew. And this was a body that for the best part of 20 years enabled our subject to punch above its weight. It made regular representations to the corridors of power. And so when changes occurred, as in 2000, there was never any question that politics couldn't be among the subjects to be reformed and would continue as applied later. But it all fell apart in sort of Shakespearean fashion in sort of 2007. I think that the catalyst was the retirement of Linton Robbins, who decided to spend more time on his boat in the Solent. And as a result, there was this fragmentation, this balkanisation of the sort of people who'd been driving the Old Politics Association, the body which would represent A-level politics to decision makers. And yet there was this period where a sort of civil war seemed to ensue. Different factions, largely regionally based, ceased to really communicate with each other very effectively. This wasn't helped by the fact that we did organise in the mid-1990s a series of loss-making conferences and a series of loss-making publications, so that by the time Linton Robbins walked away, we were facing big financial problems and we were getting increasingly testy with each other. And for a while it had become a bit like a sort of Shakespearean play, where those of us in the northwest were not communicating with Essex, we were getting news of unrest from Warwick, etc., etc. It was all very messy, and ultimately it fell apart, and that has had, I think, implications for the fact that politics has not really been a proper subject to these subjects to be reformed. I'll just point out as well that Bill Jones and I tried vainly to resurrect a body that, to bring out a body that would have been a successor to the Politics Association. We called it the Political Education Forum. It failed within a couple of years, but that was largely because our former Politics Association colleagues in other parts of the country were not playing ball. They were taking the king's shilling from organisations like Philip Allen, who were organising these conferences, and instead of getting 30 quid from us for writing an article, they were picking up rather more from attending Philip Allen conferences, etc., etc. Good luck to them, and good luck to Philip Allen, a very good organisation. But it did mean that we no longer had a body comparable to the History Association or the Economics Association to put the case. But, and I'd be delighted to have Tim refute this idea that because it's third wave, it's third right. Certainly that's the impression that a lot of us have got. That's why we've been very worried when we've been reading the boards. The problem is that those who are responsible for G&P at the A-level examination boards are also responsible for other stuff as well. So when I've been ringing up the head Excel to say, when you're getting the new spec together, he tells me he's halfway through geography, and he doesn't know when he's going to finish geography, etc., etc. So it's not helped by the fact that we haven't really got any focused subject officers in the board. But as I was saying earlier, we haven't been helped either. There's been no established, widely recognised government and politics lobby group during that crucial period leading up to the unveiling of the reform in 2013. And as I said earlier, if there isn't government and politics at A-level, there's implications for higher education as well. But, just to wrap all this up, help is on the way, thanks to people like Rose and James here. The PSA's importance has been underlined in recent years. The PSA Teachers Group has been a godsend. It's proving a worthy successor to the old Politics Association. It's early days yet, and a lot of politics teachers still aren't aware of it, but we're doing our best to make sure that they do know about it. Because here, obviously, is a body to rely on the History Association, Economics Association, the Sociology Board, and so on, to put the case for politics to people like Tim in an objective, non-commercial fashion. And I'm quite optimistic about the role that the PSA is playing in the months ahead. It's done some great work in lobbying the DFE and Ofqual. People like Rose and James have done some excellent work. And I don't think that we're going to get into this mess again as long as this third wave reform of politics does come up. I'd like to have some confirmation from Tim on that before I read. Just going back very, very briefly to the future of AS politics, I'm a little sceptical about the future of AS, as many people are. I think that AS is going to prove quite a durable examination for all those colleges who will find the new linear, rigorous A-level a bit too difficult for many of their students. It strikes me that there will still be the need for an intermediate qualification between GCSE and A-level. And if that's the case, it strikes me that an AS politics qualification, masquerading perhaps as a qualification in citizenship, could have traction in the years ahead, particularly if this whole business of 16 to 17-year-old voting does come up. Again, just going back to my own sort of birth at Manchester Grammar School, we're very, very keen in the next few years to introduce, if it comes up, a compulsory AS politics examination for everyone in the lower six. The idea would be that people would do 3 linear A-levels plus a politics qua citizenship course in the lower six, which, as you all know, is a useful thing to do, even if you're not going to carry the subject forward into university. So we are looking to see whether this AS qualification will come off. I think it could be potentially, given that citizenship as an A-level qualification is almost certainly going to disappear, it's not going to be part of the third wave at all. So if that's the case, I think that G and P at AS level could be useful for a lot of senators who are trying to sound relevant in an age of remote voting age. So that's more or less it from me. And any questions from you, I'll deal with on final list.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, can we open up to some questions? We've got about 20 minutes or so, so I'm happy to take questions to any of the speakers.
Just a question, if anyone has any insight in terms of what might happen with the change of government in May. Because we've talked about I'm not sure what the timing is for this third wave reform. I don't know whether we are sure what the timing is. But if that's going to coincide with possible change of government, I was wondering if anyone, and James probably been talking to opposition politicians a little bit about this, or if anyone else has had any contact with the Labour side. That's going to change things.
I mean, I suspect that the Labour position is sort of being quite fluid in some respects. I think about 6 months ago, they came out, the Labour Party came out and said they would probably reverse changes that have been put in place.
That's what I heard.
So, for subjects from 2050, I think anecdotally, examples part of the other reason why they're struggling to write course content for subjects further down the line.
Yeah.
Because they're also actually writing specifications that would also fall straight into place if there was a change in government and they did roll back all these changes. So you have modular specifications in place. And actually I think as well as subject officers being busy with other subjects, that could be a reason why they're struggling to get the quick turnaround for course specifications. I don't think the Labour position is ultimately clear, and you know, I suspect they're probably taking the temperature a little bit of the teaching profession, who are now starting to have to timetable and put in place the changes anyway. And it could be a huge reverse in itself to implement.
So constitutionally, the only person who's talking to the Labour Party in my department is Chris Wormald, the Permanent Secretary. So the Prime Minister of the day, shortly before an election, in this case I think from October the 1st, allows opposition shadows to come and speak to the Permanent Secretary, but he's the only person. So Chris Wormald will, I assume, be having quite substantive discussions with Tristram. I'm sure they've met, but the content of those are unknown to everyone everyone else. And that is the way the British Constitution works. It would be easy to imagine a different world. It does mean, I think, that a lot of people spend far too long lobbying government and not long enough lobbying opposition. Because frankly, the size of an opposition office is minuscule. It's made up of one short money-funded person, or maybe two if you're lucky, and then maybe someone seconded from someone like PwC. But that's about it. And the odd clever volunteer and intern. So, whereas the Secretary of State has 5,500 civil servants. So which one is more likely to be receptive to someone who wants to come along and make a cogent case? It seems that the opposition, I don't know why people don't spend a lot more time talking to oppositions, and not just in the 3 months before an election. If you're starting now and you've left it a bit late, it should be 2, 3, 4 years out, having regular meetings so that people trust you and know that you are the sort of person who brings them solutions. And what you've got to do there is think not what do I want to say to this person, but what decisions is this person going to need to make, and how can I contribute? And actually a really good lecture on this was given by Craig Calhoun, my boss at LSE, in this year's Save Social Science Committee, whatever it's called. He gave the annual lecture. If you Google Save Social Science Craig Calhoun, I think it'll come up. It happened in Ludley, and it was about 2 months ago. He talked about how the ways in which academics fail in the way they approach politicians, and having been on both sides, I thought it was a splendid lecture.
I should point out that Trustee today over politics. Taught by a bloke called Neil and Dawn at UCL, and in a conversation we had with his old politics teacher, he said he was surprised that no one had really approached him as yet about the future of this is a criticism of the PSA by any means, but I think it reflects what I was talking about earlier, the loss of any single association to represent the subject in recent years.
I want to say one thing about that, though, which is sometimes just individuals, even without an association, can be very powerful. You look at the work of Tim Gowers in mid-level maths, for example, and a handful of people who really, really wanted to seize computing and change it from ICT qualifications where kids were learning in school how to save things in Excel to something that was really based on computer science and programming. And there was a group of them who really got together, had something to say, could point to international best practice, turned up and convinced people. So if you don't have an association that's effective, don't let that be an excuse.
Matt Beach, University of Hull. I was saying to Helena earlier, there's a general and a particular point. I think the general point is I think we need more and newer and fresher patrons for political science in this country. I think when I work at Hull and I work with Philip Norton, and Philip was a driving force in this. And, but we have about 6 or 7 members of the House of Lords who are political scientists: Halle Afshar, William Wallace, Trevor Smith, Vicky Parrott, Raymond Clark, who's Professor. Philip Norton. There's a number of people, but we need better patrons at the elite level to be able to make these points. That's my general. The particular point is this: it strikes me that another factor will be really for our core business how many Treasury-backed student loans there are in a given year. If there are more Treasury-backed student loans, there is a greater supply of students. If there are a greater supply of students, there are more students that we're all going to be competing against each other for in the 60-odd political science department. And so, okay, Matt, tell us something we don't know. My question is this: if you have a linear model and you have certain centres or schools or what have you pushing the traditional 3 in that sense, and others, maybe sort of like some schools in Hull or what have you, doing a different one because it's not as rigorous or what have you, is that not going to lead to an increasing diversity, an increasing inequality of students in terms of their actual qualification tariff when they get into applying to UCAS and get into universities? And isn't that going to be a headache for us down the line? Potentially.
Well, student loans are now unlimited. The government's deregulated student numbers at undergraduate level, and you may have seen in the autumn statement yesterday it's also announced £10,000 loans for postgraduate study. I'm particularly pleased about that because I wrote that as a pamphlet in 2011, shortly before I joined government, so I'm definitely quite smart, really.
Yeah.
And I think those are good things. So, you can now recruit as many people as you are willing to let in.
Well, yeah, but it's not jam today and jam tomorrow, I think, as we know. And I think what the autumn statement does show us is that these next 3 financial years are going to make the last 3 financial years look like the fat years.
Tell me about it.
And so I think there are
Tell me about it.
VCs are going to take a slightly more, well, slightly different view. So I'm just thinking, is there going to be an increase in diversity in tariff when students get to us in terms of whether they've gone down an AS route, the 3 AS or 2 AS? That's my question.
I guess the sort of anecdotal stuff we get from the teachers is actually, as much as anything, it sort of falls back to the parents and that key stage 4 bit. And I think that's the sort of angle the association is beginning to look at in terms of materials and how we can promote students to go and do politics as well as 3 linear subjects. I mean, I guess in terms of the diversity of what's on offer, there could be an increased range of options in that sense. I mean, the linear subjects will, in many ways, they're designed to make the course content more up-to-date and more rigorous. In many ways, the government politics is actually quite a difficult area in itself, and Richard's slide about the numbers alone, why it wasn't in the second grade, well, actually, the course content shouldn't be that difficult to redesign. It actually fits a linear process quite nicely. In terms of students picking different subjects and having that diversity, I think much of that will depend upon this clarification of AS and the decoupling. And at the moment, I just don't think there's enough information about whether that is actually formal decoupling or whether students will be able to pick up these AS levels in all subjects.
Thank you.
I don't think there'll be any huge change in the diversity of students because you'll have some students who've done government politics A and some who haven't. I'm an economist, that's always been true for me. I now teach economic history, and virtually none of my students have done economic history. And also, as someone who teaches at the LSE, I think we have 142 nationalities this year. Our colleague was telling me they taught their first Mongolian student. So, if you've got a student from Kazakhstan, and a student from Mongolia, and a student, etc., we've got diversity coming out of our ears, and we cope perfectly well. If anything, I'd say it's a strength, because people are bringing different experiences to the classroom.
Not everyone's going to see. I think that's the point. Not everyone. I mean, London is a global village. It's not like Hull and more pretty. But my point is that that it might work for the LSE.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure necessarily works out the English provincial
But I'm
university.
just saying, as a faculty member, I am used to coping with huge heterogeneity of my students'
I'm sure you
backgrounds.
are.
And
I'm sure you are.
and it's just not something that really worries me as an academic.
I'm sure it
I'd urge you not to.
Okay, thanks.
Can I just come back to that? Because I'm a master, I'm in disguise because I'm a teacher. But we're echoing what you're saying because we're unsure. The school's taking a decision at the moment, from what it seems, to not do ASs, just go through linear. But as Richard was mentioning, somewhere like Cambridge, who are talking about these, basically basing a lot of their decision-making process. Our university is going to be, are they going to feed us back information on how they're going to look at things as well? That's what I think we're uncertain about.
Well, you're looking at me for that.
Well, I'm looking at anyone. I'm looking at the group.
Because, firstly, in a school-led system, it is definitely your choice as to the curriculum you offer. We do not want somebody at Whitehall setting down and saying that government and politics should be a compulsory AS level. But we do want to allow schools to say government and politics should be a compulsory AS level. We want to see those 1,000 flowers bloom. Now, as to what universities don't tell you, Cambridge has been very vocal in putting forward its point of view. But actually, we haven't seen large numbers of other universities standing up and saying, we are with Cambridge on this and writing to schools and saying that. So, my sense is that your students will be fine.
Given the stress on co-teachability, new abilities, using an AS first and then finish up an A-level and
That's fine.
I would have thought that is the route that most schools will go down.
Yeah.
Because how can you possibly offer an AS course and a separate A-level course? What we would like to know, really, is whether those who got an A-level that way, thinking of an AS midway through, whether their A-level would be as prestigious and as valid as one who does the linear course. Because if that is the case, why would we want to do the linear course? Why would they not want to pick up a qualification at the end of their lower six?
I think that depends on how you choose to teach the A-level. So if I get back to my history A-level, I did history 87 to 89, so it was before AS levels, and half of the course was on the Civil War, and half of it was on the European Reformation and Counter-Reformation. So you could easily imagine, since it was essentially 2 AS levels joined together, that a school may still choose to teach the AS level linearly, rather than teaching one in the lower sixth and one in what my school called the middle sixth. So I think it's about timetabling and when you want. So we did both of them simultaneously, which would have meant I couldn't have sat an AS level at the end of the first year. And also, given that the AS is supposed to be as rigorous as the A level, there is a concern that if you take it at the end of the first year, you may end up with a lower grade. And therefore, I don't think everyone is going to teach it that way by any means. Some will, some won't, and luckily, we will see what works. It's the sort of question you cannot work out ex ante which will be more successful. And it's also not the case that what works in your school will necessarily work in your school, because schools are different. And that's why we want to see experimentation.
I mean, perhaps this is a more general question or comment, but what I'd like to know is what's always baffled me about this country. Why is it that students are so ill-equipped to write an essay at university level? Why do they lack the basic grammatical skills? Why can't they string a simple sentence together? What's going on in the education system that does grammar not get taught?
I would say GCSE is the main explanation.
Well, I would say actually it's primary school.
Well, sorry, yeah. So the point is that they need remedial, when they come to university, they need remedial help, you know.
And the minister said that about the quality of ministerial letters being sent out as well. So we are now, because we do know that to some extent what gets measured gets taught. And so in the last, I think it was last year, it's the first year, we now have a GAPS test in primary school with age 11, grammar, punctuation, spelling. Which for some reasons they call SPAG at GCSE for spelling, punctuation and grammar. And there are now a certain proportion of marks at GCSE that are reserved for SPAG. So now at age 11 and at age 16, that has to happen. So I hope that in 25 years' time, adults will be better at these things than many of them are now.
Because I mean, it's a big problem. It's not, I mean,
They teach them as well.
it's not the background knowledge of politics. It's just a simple, basic, grammatical skills, simple basic skills for writing, which they really struggle with.
But I don't think we should necessarily assume it was better in the past. I remember my undergraduate essays, I had this bizarre belief that the longer the sentence, the better. I didn't have that belief.
That change is going to take a while to.
Yeah,
That's
well,
only very recent.
it is because the last couple of years.
Can I just add an anecdotal comment on behalf of my absent mother, who I should not mention, she's in Scotland. She's 67, going on 68. She won't thank me for telling you, but she is a teacher and an education psychologist, primary teacher, who has never left the classroom.
Excellent.
And she cannot retire. She's been trying to retire for 5 years, and head teachers keep going back and saying, we want you for another year when you come to this. She takes year 1, and she gets parents in to teach them how to read to their kids, to write sentences to their kids. And the trouble she's got is she has given other teachers work to correct the grammar spelling on. She proofread my PhD because she was taught grammar all those years ago, but there's an entire generation of teachers in between who now cannot teach grammar. So I think we might be looking at a 2-generational problem, and my mother might be teaching when she's 80 because she still understands all that and puts great value in it. So I think there is a really important problem.
And actually that's why we've insisted that the grammar marks aren't just in English. We're trying to say these things matter whatever you're doing. So that when my wife was a teacher, her head of department had a maths test that said, 1 stamp is 20 pence. What are 10 stamps? With no question mark. Well, actually 10 stamps are 10 stamps. There are also 10 methods of conveying 10 items around the world. And the correct answer of £2 is not the correct answer to what are 10 stamps. Yeah. And we need a few more students who have enough guts to write 10 stamps are 10 stamps at times like that. And to say, if you were trying to ask me how much they cost, you should have said, how much would they cost? It will rebellion in schools at that point.
I just want to make one point which was made within the last teachers group meeting. I'm having a look at the PSA. And I think it goes to that point about the risk of the growing divergence between the schools with good resources, primarily private ones, and the ones who are more strained. And one of the teachers was saying that if the AS exam doesn't count towards anything, then there's a cost to actually sitting the exam, and those schools won't. So there is a distinct danger that it's the private schools that continue, that politics, government politics continues to flourish in the private schools. And we already see quite a lot of that. But it's actually within the state schools that are more pressurised for resources, where it's going to go. And it's very sad because actually we see we've involved a lot of events, particularly in London, you know, a lot of states with a huge amount of enthusiasm for the subject, and particularly also this very diverse student, you know, ethnically very, very diverse group of students studying it. And I think that's where we might see the change, and that should be quite worrying for us.
Yeah, austerity is here for a while.
Well, for some more than others.
Can I pick up one of Richard's comments about numbers studying A-level? What apparently a throwaway line, but a very interesting one. We're losing the girls. Why is it that we're losing, we aren't attracting females to do politics? Is it the thing that this psychology do much better than we are? Or is it the way in which they're assessing these structural reforms we're seeing have an impact on the choices girls make?
Well, I got the impression it was evidence. It was going back to when I arrived at university in the late 70s. It was a predominantly male outfit then. I think it might be something inherent to the nature of the subject. These are deep waters that I'll not get into. but clearly, I think, as long as I know, sociology has been overwhelmingly female and politics has been overwhelmingly male. Sorry,
my university, we combine politics and international relations, and we're overwhelmingly female. We don't have many British students coming from British schools with A-level politics, but we have more women than men taking politics now.
If you want to know the gender ratios going back in time, we have the National Pupil Database that records who has got what qualification for everybody aged 31 and below. And we give that data out to about 500, 600 organisations a year. So long as you have a secure computer and you say why you want the data, we will give you that data. So you could find out the gender mix over time. You could also link that data to the HESA data and work out, because there are some schools that just don't offer politics and government. So you could work out the propensity, conditional on certain GCSE scores and A-level grades for people in schools that don't offer politics to go into politics at university, which would allow you to construct a counterfactual of what would happen to university student numbers if A-level politics disappeared. And that would be a pretty straightforward exercise for any quants person. If you want that data, then you can apply for that. That would be a bona fide request, and we will give you the data.
Interestingly, I recall the Politics Association discovering in about 2001 after the introduction of modularity, that modularity seems, well, modularity coincided at least with an increase in the number of female students doing such as that might be a point there.
Yeah, two very quick points. The first one is the question of essays and language. I don't think the problem with students writing essays or coming to university prepared to write an essay is just because they haven't done spelling or grammar. It's also because they haven't done the basics of logic of argumentation. That's the main sort of problem, is they're about to construct an argument. It's not writing it, the writing it can be relatively quick. The other point is, I wonder whether my slight concern is whether those who are discussing the nature of the future of government politics A-levels are struggling to get their head around whether they're preparing students for social science or preparing students for humanities subjects. This ties to my first point. It sits on that divide between the two, and I think that makes it quite difficult to articulate how you want an overall approach. The question of linearity versus modularity, well, it's interesting if you read the new QAA subject benchmark. I got the draft about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and the QAA benchmark for higher education puts a huge stress on political science, meaning case studies and methods, not just long kind of narrative. And I wonder whether one of my concerns as somebody who studied history as an undergraduate and A-level and did do politics is too often politics is viewed as political history and not as political science. And that's a concern. I think that ties back to the question of how they come to university prepared to do a range of social science subjects. Just as one small analogy, a friend of mine is the head of a geography department at Oldham College, and the subjects that's closest that they teach to what I do in international relations is human geography, not government and politics.
I endorse his comments were well made. And geography is also a subject that wonders where it is. Physical geography versus human geography versus, LSE has a sort of organised department with 3 chunks of geography.
Very strong connection with Sheffield and Ron Johnston years ago.
Sorry, I just wanted to endorse what just was said, having teenage daughters who've chosen geography and politics. One the other one chosen geography and politics. I have to say that geography, human geography, is far more exciting, far more interesting than the American politics, American Constitution, which she's ploughing her way through. And I have to say, this is a student who is genuinely very, very politically engaged, very interested. But the politics curriculum, the politics curriculum offers very little. It's very dull and boring. It's well taught in a city comprehensive in London, but it's boring.
It's largely down to the teachers. You're right. When you get to A2, the upper sixth course, you do have a choice as to which route you go down. And overwhelmingly, the most popular route is American government and American politics. Largely because teachers think that they can teach you in pretty much the same way as they taught the AS course in British politics in the first year. A minority of us don't go down that route. We do political ideologies, which is very exciting, of course, but it's also harder to predict in terms of how people will do in the neighbourhood. It's harder to teach prescriptively, which of course makes it more interesting, but at the same time you've got to deal with student and parental expectations and other results.
Thank you. I think we've probably reached the end of this session. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you to the people who've asked questions. I think some of those points towards the end perhaps give all of us a lot of things to think about, particularly what sort of ways in which we might be able to get engaged now with what happens with the government politics over reform, and particularly those sort of points about the need to sort of re-energise it, if you like, and get in there and think about